Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It is really an honour to speak to this bill, as it is an honour to speak to all bills in this Assembly. Now, I may not be from rural Alberta, but I know a bad bill when I see one. This is actually not a rural issue or an urban issue. It is an Alberta issue. It's a fundamental issue of how a government goes about passing legislation and how, in fact, a government consults or doesn't consult the people who are impacted by a certain piece of legislation. But let me tell you this. As an MLA representing an urban constituency, I want to let everyone in this Assembly and through you to all of your constituents know that urban Alberta has got your back. Because this is not an issue of urban and rural. This is a fundamental issue of fairness and democracy. And there is a lot of concern about this bill that I've heard from my constituents in Calgary-Elbow. It is not just an issue that impacts people just in rural Alberta. Now, there's an extended way that we are all impacted no matter where we live. If, as it's been said many times, if you ate today, thank a farmer. Absolutely, that's true, but there's something more important than that. Albertans all around this province, from inner-city Edmonton and Calgary and Red Deer and Lethbridge and rural Alberta, and even from outside of Alberta, as I've heard from my cousins and relatives in Saskatchewan, are wondering what the heck's going on, wondering what the big deal is about Bill 6. And the minute they learn a little bit about it, they say, well, that doesn't feel right. That just doesn't seem right. What in the world are we doing here? Why are we rushing through this? Now, I want to be very, very clear that farm safety is important to me, and I think it's absolutely important to every single one of us in this House. We want people to go home safe at the end of the day. We want people who work in paid employment on farms to be safe, to have access to compensation and workers' compensation, and we want people to make sure that proper standards are applied. We want every single person, whether they're a paid employee, whether they're a family member, whether they're hired help, whether they're an uncle from across the fence line, to be safe on a farm. But what I haven't seen, and what I'm very, very curious to know from the government side, is what are the numbers? What problem are we trying to solve here? Early on tonight in the debate, the member for Drumheller-Stettler quoted some statistics and indicated that, in fact, Alberta's numbers of injury and fatality on the farm were, in fact, no worse than other parts of Canada. Now, I don't know that definitively to be true. I've heard it here in the House tonight. I'm going to do some research. But I would hope that the government would also have done that research and could tell us definitively what problem are we trying to solve here. What is the scale of this problem? Tell that to this House, tell that to Albertans, how big a problem that really is. I'm learning here. I'd like to know. I'd really like to know. One farm fatality is too many. I think we would all agree with that. Any injury is too much of an injury. That's not something that any of us want to see. But how do we go about solving those problems? Before we go to solve a problem, we need to identify what the problem is. We need to understand the scale of the problem, understand the nature of the problem, do that research, present it here to this House, so we can all make sure we understand how that works. So I would really be interested, and I notice that every speaker this evening has been on this side of the House. I'd be really interested to hear what the Government Caucus has to say on this issue, and would love to hear what they what the rationale is and some of the details, because I genuinely care about people's safety in this province. The bill itself, I have significant concerns which have been talked about previously, but what this bill is, when we look at it, it's a very thin bill. It is a shell of a bill that says at some point in the future the government will pass some regulations that do some things. And so we've heard some pretty concerning things of what Bill 6 might do. It might regulate 4-H. It might mean that kids can work only limited hours. It might mean that once equipment's a certain age, you can't use it anymore. Well, Bill 6 doesn't say any of that. Nowhere does it say that in Bill 6. But nowhere in Bill 6 does it not say that. When there's a vacuum, when there's a lack of information, in rush judgment. And so we have no leg to stand on. When someone says, Greg, this bill regulates 4-H, I can't point to anything in this bill and say, no, that's not true. Look here, it says right here that it doesn't do that, because that's not what Bill 6 says. Now, we hear that there's some amendments coming, and I look forward to seeing those amendments in committee. Until such time, unfortunately, speculation is going to be rampant. And, my friends, that is on this government for allowing that to happen. Now, I'd like to compare what happens with Bill 6 with the work that the Environment Minister did on the climate consultation. And you all know, I think, I've been very clear in this House, that I think very highly of the process that the Environment Minister went through in creating a panel with very clear terms of reference, an expert panel that included stakeholders from industry, that included stakeholders from environmental groups, that had a very broad public input process. And the outcome of that process, while I don't agree with absolutely everything in that, we can't argue that the process that was followed was a very strong and very sound process. And I sincerely hope that the royalties process is the same thing. There are expert people who are in charge of that panel. They've consulted widely across industry. They've held public consultations. In fact, up until December 4th, we as Albertans can submit our input into the royalties panel. I've done that. I hope everyone here does the same thing. And the outcome of that work product, I don't know if we'll all agree with it or not, but we won't be able to quibble with the process they used to come up with those results. Let's compare that to what's happened with Bill 6. Now, you're the NDP. We know you're going to legislate in this area. That's not a surprise. But what is a surprise is exactly what's in this bill, or what's not in this bill. So I would really encourage you to reflect on why we've had 1,500 people on the steps of this building protesting and concerned about their livelihoods and concerned about family farms, when we haven't had that on the climate panel. And there's some very bold policy coming out of that climate panel that is going to fundamentally change how Alberta operates. That's a big deal. It's important. It's important to the future of this province. And it was taken seriously by your government. And you should be given credit for that. Why haven't you taken Bill 6 seriously? Why haven't you taken the family farm seriously? Did you just think, well, it doesn't really matter, we're just going to do it anyway? This is a lesson. I think it's an important lesson for all of us in this House to understand, not just on the government side, but for all of us to understand. It sure feels like you're taking rural Alberta for granted. It sure feels that way. There's a lot of so as we get towards the amendments. So far, what we know of these proposed amendments are two bullet points in a news release. So getting closer, there's talk of exemptions for family farms, but there are some exemptions earlier on this evening listed out in other jurisdictions. Our neighbours to the east in Saskatchewan, some of the specific areas that are exempt from family farm regulation. It raises questions for me. What if someone brings in a hired help for a couple of days to help fix fences, to move cattle or help during calving season? What if you accept payment in kind? Will you have to get WCB or OH&S for that? Will you still be able to use equipment? What if you bring somebody in to use equipment? None of these things are clear. And to simply say we're going to pass regulation at some point that covers these things, it just leaves so many questions that I really believe this bill needs to go back to committee. We need to either pull the bill entirely and do a proper consultation, or at least send it to committee. So as it stands, I can't support this bill. I care very deeply about safety of all Albertans. I care deeply about farm safety. But this bill is ill-conceived. It needs to go back to the drawing board. At the very least, we need to send it to a committee. We need to study it extensively. We need to consult Albertans. And that may mean killing this bill entirely, starting again. I guess I'll conclude, Madam Speaker, by just saying what Bill 6 lacks more than anything else is respect. Respect for the people who are impacted by the provisions of that bill. That is a fundamental tenet of any legislation. You have to consult. But what does consulting mean? Consulting doesn't mean telling. Consulting means asking. Consulting is a two-way process. It's a dialogue. And I think the government would find, had you consulted on this bill, we wouldn't have had 1,500 people on the steps of the legislature. You wouldn't be receiving angry emails and phone calls and letters in your constituency offices. And I think that you have the opportunity to make this right, and I encourage you to do that. Thank you very much.